Professor Hsiao, it's great to have you on Capturing Christianity. Now, before we get into the interview today, I actually want to ask you a little about your background, how you got interested in philosophy and really in applied ethics, because that's, I think, where most of your work is. But before we get to that, I just wanted to say another thank you to the Evangelical Philosophical Society, who has been so gracious to give us these rooms that we've been able to do these interviews in. It's been such an honor and such a pleasure to be in contact with them and work with them and make these happen. And then in addition, we've been working with Defenders Media. They provide media solutions to apologetic ministries. Kurt Jaros is he's become a great friend over the months that I've been in contact with him. So it's great to have him on board and be in partnership with them. All right, Sam, let's get into today's interview on morality, sexual ethics, and abortion. This is going to be a fantastic and very interesting and probably controversial, this topic that we're discussing today, which is really three different topics all kind of compiled into one. So how did your interest in ethics and philosophy of ethics and everything, how did that begin for you? Did it happen at an early age, or was it something that happened later on?
Yeah, I got into philosophy in general by getting into apologetics. So it was all the way back when I was 12 years old. I remember I was browsing an internet forum, and I got into a discussion on just the existence of God, and I got my butt whooped in that discussion. I really had it handed to me, and I was pretty disappointed in how I did. So I said to myself, well, maybe I should start reading, learning why I actually believe what I believe. Because it's important if I'm going to dialogue with these people to give reasons for faith, right? So I started reading some apologetics, middle school, high school, started with Lee Strobel's books, moved on to people like Norman Geisler, J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig. And it was around the time when I left for college, I had decided to become a philosophy major. I started with apologetics, but then I gradually shifted in philosophy because I just waded into more complex topics. And I noticed that there were a lot of ethical issues, beliefs that I held, beliefs that I regarded as, common sense, beliefs that the church has held for more than 2,000 years. And I noticed that it wasn't being defended. These beliefs weren't really they were taken for granted, but people really just didn't defend them at an academic level. So I got into ethics because I felt as if Christian moral teaching needed a rational defense. And so that got me into natural law. And ever since then, I've been writing on natural law approaches to just all of the ethical controversies of our time. I'm quite the controversial guy. If you've read my papers, somebody has to do it. So I figured, well, why not me? If nobody else is doing it, somebody's got to defend these time-honored doctrines.
Yeah, I've noticed that on Facebook and everything, your posts are incredibly bold, and you also have you get a lot of hate mail for some of the papers that you've defended. And these aren't like Facebook posts or Twitter posts that you put up that people are hating on. These are actual academically accepted and published papers that you've written that people are hating on. So tell me a little about that and what that experience has been like.
Yeah, you'd think. So I've written on a variety of topics, homosexuality, recreational drug use, the ethics of eating meat, gun control, immigration, you name it. So you'd expect that I'd get more pushback on, homosexuality, right? But surprisingly, the area I get the most pushback on is in my work in environmental ethics. I guess my work has really ruffled the feathers of quite a number of vegans who write really disparaging, hateful remarks to me saying, oh, you have no soul, you have no regard for animals. How could you write a paper defending the consumption of meat, which most of us do, which I regard as common sense? But it's interesting, the amount of vitriol in there. And I've gotten some hate from my work on homosexuality, but not nearly as much as my work on animal ethics, which, you'd expect, again, me defending a non-popular position in sexual ethics to get more pushback from that. But no, I guess for those who, not all vegans are like this, of course, but there's sort of a cultish mentality among those who believe in animal rights that I guess prompt them to send me all this hate mail that I've collected in a nice little folder out of my computer I share it occasionally on Facebook from time to time. Like, I get a chuckle out of it personally.
Okay, that's the next question I had for you. It was like, how do you handle this personally? Do you have really thick skin? What is it like? I mean, you say you put it all in like a little folder. How does it affect you psychologically? The pushback that you've seen.
It humors me. I don't feel any kind of pressure or any kind of negative.
You're not going to back down.
I'm not going to. Of course, I'm not going to. No, I'm not going to back down just because.
Take back your papers.
Just because somebody sent me an email saying you're the scum of the earth, I'm not going to take back my position. I'll just go.
And that's an actual thing that someone said to you.
I can't say what's been said here, but people have used choice words to describe me and my positions.
Which is crazy. I mean, it's so crazy to me. Okay, you think, even if you think you're wrong, or whoever is listening to this, even if they think that you're wrong, why can't they just have like a rational discourse and debate with you instead of resorting to name calling?
I guess they feel strongly about it. Like I said, there's in the animal rights community, there's sort of this cultish mentality that, but not all animal rights and vegans advocate are. They have this mentality, but certainly it's more than usual. And I guess they'd rather just insult me than listen to an argument that I have to give, which is not surprising given today's just culture where people put their feelings over what's actually logical, what's actually factual. So I can't say I'm too surprised. I will say that I've had people who have changed their minds on issues that I've written about email me, sending their appreciation, sending their thanks. So it's not as if my work doesn't make an impact. I have changed minds, and I've helped others navigate some really complex waters. So I think I'm doing good work.
I think applied ethics for me is like one of the most difficult subjects. I don't know why. Maybe I've just tried to stay away from it. I'm more interested in meta ethics and the foundations, the grounding of morality. So that's why I personally just haven't really dove in yet. But yeah, your work too has been like, because politically I try to stay in the middle ground because I don't really know what my views are yet. I used to be very, very solid conservative, but then over a while I started to notice that there was actually a lot of Christian philosophers who lean more liberal, and I'm like, well, that's weird, right? Because you would think that most philosophers would line up with the views that I held growing up and everything. So I started to sort of question my own conservative values and thoughts and ideas. And your work has been an interesting insight into the philosophy behind these conservative values. So let's go ahead and jump into your theory on morality, your moral theories. So consent forms the basis, I think, of most of our ethic as a culture. And as long as there's consent between two adults, seems like there's nothing wrong with it. That's so prevalent in culture and society. So what in your mind is wrong with that? Yeah,
so we have to get clear on what consent is. So to consent to something, if I consent for you to do something, for me to do something, it's giving permission. Consent is the act of giving permission for somebody to do something that would otherwise be forbidden. However, I can't give you permission to do something if I don't already have that permission to begin with. I can't give what I do not have, right? So to base morality on consent, to say that, well, consent makes something right, is to presuppose that it's already right for you. Right? I can't give my permission for you to do something unless it's already permissible for me to begin with. So basing morality on consent actually begs the question by assuming in advance
that you have that to give.
That is already okay. So consent is useful, certainly, but it can't form the basis of an ethical system. It has to presuppose some more basic moral system. And the real question we should look at is, what is this more basic moral system? It can't be consent because consent relies on that more basic moral system.
Oh, I see. So you've got to have a moral system already in place. Yeah. Okay, so related to the idea of consent is the idea that as long as it doesn't harm other people, it's okay to do it. And that's actually something I believed growing up, is that, there were times in my life where I'd be like, this is okay to do as long as it's not hurting anybody. So I can do this. There's no wrong in this. So what do you think is wrong about that moral principle?
Yeah, I don't think there is such a thing as a victimless crime. So we have to get clear on what we mean by harm. And a harm in general, there's many different kinds of harm, but a harm is just a setback to a being's interests. A harm is just a setback to something's welfare, something's flourishing, something's eudaimonia. So harm can be cashed out in multiple ways. Obviously, there's a paradigmatic sense of harm. If I punch you in the face, I've harmed you physically. But I can harm you in many different ways. I can harm you morally. I can harm you spiritually. I can harm you with respect to your family. I can harm you with respect to your education, your just any aspect of your flourishing that has conditions for proper functioning can be harmed, right? So when we talk about harming others, we first have to be clear that not all harm is physical. There can be harms that are more subtle, but that qualify as real harms. So something like same-sex marriage might not harm somebody physically in the sense that punching somebody in the face harms them, but it does result in real harms to, say, the family, to culture, to religious liberty, to a whole bunch of things. And these harms are kind of subtle, but they're still harms. And so that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that...
So the first thing, just to clarify, is that there's still probably harm going on.
Yeah.
Even if it's not physical harm, or even mental harm, there's some kind of harm going on. Probably.
I would say any kind of immoral action is a kind of harm insofar as it involves a privation or a lack of what there should be.
Okay.
A harm is just a lack of order, a lack of proper order, a lack of well-being, a lack of flourishing. And so any wrong action is going to be by definition a harm. So if something is wrong, it's also harmful. Maybe not in the paradigmatic way of, punching you in the face, breaking your nose, that kind of harm, but it's still a harm, maybe in a moral sense or a mental sense or a spiritual sense, but it's still a harm.
Okay. And then the second part of that, that was your first objection to this principle. Did you have another?
Yeah. So people typically say that, as long as you don't harm other people, it's fine. Mm-hmm. Well, you can harm yourself. It's possible to do something bad to oneself. I mean, I have flourishing conditions. I have, proper functions. I have a standard for my well-being. And what exactly is the difference between harming somebody and harming myself? And somebody might argue that, in harming yourself, you voluntarily assume it. You consent to it. And so harming yourself is different from harming somebody else. Well, we have to go back to the point about consent, right? Consent is giving somebody permission to do something that would otherwise be forbidden. And when it comes to yourself, if you have an obligation to take care of yourself, to develop your talents, to flourish, to pursue what's good and avoid what's evil, then you have an obligation not to harm yourself. So even actions that are self-regarding, for example, recreational drug use, right? That might not harm somebody else, but it harms yourself. And so such actions would still be morally impermissible. So the thing about harm is that we have to be clear on what kind of harm we're talking about. And second, we have to realize that we can harm ourselves. The fundamental moral obligation we all have, the most basic moral obligation we have, is to pursue what's good and to avoid what's evil. And pursuing what's good means pursuing what is perfective or what enhances something's flourishing.
Not just what doesn't harm us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have flourishing conditions, and insofar as those flourishing conditions can be thwarted, I can harm myself. And so I have an obligation not to, disrupt my health, not to smoke, not to, use marijuana recreationally, not to cut myself. In general, I have an obligation to take care of myself as a wise steward.
So related to this idea of self is the idea of self-ownership, which is what libertarians argue for. Because we own ourselves, therefore we can do whatever we want to ourselves. What's the matter with this moral theory?
Yeah, so I don't deny that there is a sense in which we own ourselves, but the sense in which we own ourselves is very different from what the libertarian says. The libertarian says we own ourselves like we own our own property. So let's say I have a cup, right? I can do whatever I want to that cup. I can
smash it,
paint it a different color, sell it, just fill it with water.
Can eat it if I want.
If I eat it if I want, I guess. Put it on the shelf and never do anything with it. And I can do that because it's my property. It has no value of its own. It's just an object that doesn't have any rights, responsibilities, or value. But if we own ourselves in very different ways than how we own mere property. Because unlike, say, a cup, I have inherent value. I have obligations. I have rights. And so my self-ownership is constrained by the rights and obligations I have, not just to other people, but to myself. So if I have an obligation to myself, and I do, it's rooted in the fundamental obligation to pursue what's good and avoid what's evil. If I have an obligation to pursue my own flourishing, my own well-being, self-ownership cannot be so extensive that it allows me to destroy myself, sell myself into slavery, maim myself, injure myself, anything that detracts from my well-being. I mean, the purpose of property ownership is to enhance the well-being of the property owner. And since I have an obligation to pursue my own well-being, I must use the rights I have over myself to enhance what's good for me. And so self-ownership doesn't justify what the libertarian wants it to justify. I can't destroy myself. I can't commit suicide. I can't, throw away my life with drugs. I can't do any of that kind of stuff because it detracts from my proper functioning.
So you've talked a lot about rights and the rights that we have. Mm-hmm. What are what's the basis of our rights, and then what are the limits to those rights?
Yeah. So people use rights talk these days. I have a right to this, I have a right to that. And people really have just lost an idea of just what rights are, where they come from, why we have rights in general. So a right in general is just a claim. It's an entitlement to something that either something I need to flourish or to non-interference on the part of somebody not to meddle with my affairs. So we have rights. Rights function as a kind of shield, a moral shield that protects us as we go about our flourishing. So I have a right to life because I need my life in order to flourish. I have a right to the respect of other people because it's necessary that I be treated well in order that I flourish. I have a right to food and water because I need food and water in order to flourish. So rights exist for the sake of protecting my well-being, protecting my flourishing, protecting me as I go about pursuing my obligation. So rights are connected to obligations. There are no rights without obligations. I have the right to life because I have the right to use my life to pursue and to unfold the various potentialities inherent within me. So rights are limited by the purpose for which they're given. And since the purpose of a right is to enhance my well-being, a right can't extend to something that detracts from my well-being. I don't have a right to do what's wrong. That would be self-contradictory. A right is something that protects my flourishing, and so I can't be entitled to something that detracts from my flourishing. So rights are closely tied to obligations, and obligations, the most fundamental obligation we have, is to pursue what's good for us and to avoid what's bad for us.
So going back to the first question that I asked about consent, you said that consent relies on some more fundamental moral theory. And we can't just assume that because we got to know what that moral theory is first. So what moral theory do you defend, and what are the benefits that it has, and maybe some potential objections?
Yeah, I could spend a long time on this, but in general, I defend what's called classical natural law theory. And on classical natural law theory, morality is rooted in proper functioning. So let's take an example. What is a good pencil? Well, a good pencil is one that writes well, something that fulfills its function. What is a good teacher? Well, a good teacher is one who instructs well, one who imparts knowledge to his students well. And so a good teacher is one who fulfills his function. Likewise, a good firefighter is somebody who fights fires well because the purpose of a firefighter is to fight fires. And so something is good if it fulfills its function. And we can't call something good unless we know what its function is. So suppose I asked you, well, what's a good hygrometer? Well, unless you knew what hygrometers were for, you couldn't tell me what a good hygrometer is. Same thing with badness. Badness presupposes proper functioning. So goodness and badness are dependent on this idea of proper functioning, how things ought to be, the idea that things have a nature, a normative essence that dictates what's good for them, what's bad for them, so on and so forth.
And so you apply this concept to humans.
Yeah, so human beings. So whereas, say, a good orange tree is good as an orange tree, it's not morally good, right? An orange tree that rots due to some disease isn't morally bad. Humans, however, humans are capable of reasoning. And so we can deliberate about the good. We can pursue what's good. We can know and understand, reflect, and internalize the good. For humans, the good becomes moral goodness. And so we have a moral obligation to pursue what fulfills our function and to avoid what detracts from our functioning. So take something like homosexuality. Natural law theory leads naturally to what's called the perverted faculty argument. And the perverted faculty argument says it's wrong to misuse some body part because your body part has certain proper functions, and it functions in a certain way, it's good. And if it doesn't function in that way, it's bad. So for example, lungs are for breathing. And so good lungs are lungs that breathe well, whereas bad lungs are, for example, like a smoker's lungs that doesn't function as they should. So when it comes to something like homosexuality, bestiality, any kind of non-marital sex, those things are wrong because they misuse the proper function of our human body. And so what we have here in natural law theory is a rather straightforward way of evaluating moral problems. To know whether something is good or bad, just ask yourself, does it accord with the proper functioning of my body considered as a whole? Whether is it good for me as a human being? If it's not good for me, then it's bad, therefore wrong.
All right, so we've already basically jumped into sexual ethics here, and you've also argued against consent-based sexual ethics in your work. So what would a natural law sexual ethic look like as an alternative?
Right, so a natural law sexual ethics starts with the purpose and nature of sex. Sex is, the purpose of sex is twofold. So there's obviously procreation, which is biologically obvious. And second, there's comprehensive union. And let me speak a bit about the comprehensive union purpose of sex. So sex brings together two individuals in a way that no other action does. So if I shake hands with you, or if I bump into you in a subway car, or if I'm a doctor and I stick my hand into, your body during a surgery, I don't unite with you. Sex unites individuals comprehensively and in a real way. Now, how is that done? Well, take the idea of a unity. What is it that unites my body together as a single united entity? I have various parts. I've got eyes, lungs, kidneys, hearts, so on and so forth. What is it that makes all of those things work together as a single unified entity? Well, notice that all the parts of my body work together to fulfill a common purpose. They work together to sustain the whole organism. So sex unites two individuals together in that the sexual act brings together two individuals to fulfill a common function that neither individual can fulfill on their own. There is only one function with respect to which every human being is naturally incomplete, and that's reproduction. You can't reproduce on your own. Reproduction requires another human being. And so sex unites two human beings together in the sense that they are brought together to fulfill a common function that neither individual can fulfill on their own. So in that sense, sex also has a unitive function, but that unitive function supervenes on the procreative function. It's in virtue of the procreative function that sex is unitive. So when it comes to good sex, when it comes to morally permissible sex, we have to evaluate sexual activities by whether or not they respect the purpose of sex, which is to procreate and to unite spouses together. So take something like homosexuality. Does homosexuality respect the functions of sex? Well, it seems that it fails on both counts, right? Homosexuality or homosexual sexual activity does not result in procreation. And because it does not result in procreation, it doesn't result in a comprehensive unity. Or take something like...
what about two people who just are infertile? Maybe the woman can't have babies. Is there something wrong there between those?
Yeah, so a good question. It's a common objection against my view. I would distinguish between acts that are procreative in type and acts that are procreative in effect. So even in a case where you have two individuals who are sterile, the parts are still being used correctly. It's not as if they're being directed towards some goal that's incompatible with their function. Now, it happens to be that in the case of sex between infertile couples, they can't actually procreate. but the complementarity is still there. The parts are still striving to fulfill their end. Here's an example. So a blind eye, right, retains an eye that's blind still ought to see, even if it's blind, even if you can't actually see. It remains the kind of thing oriented towards oriented towards sight. So in the case of sex, even infertile sexual organs are still oriented towards procreation, even if they can't actually produce that effect. And so what matters in good sex is that you respect the orientation, the natural direction of the sexual organs. And so long as that respect is still there, it doesn't matter whether or not the actual end of procreation is achieved. Now, I will say, however, that intentionally rendering yourself infertile or sterile, say getting a tubal ligation or vasectomy, that would be immoral because it would be damaging and it would be destroying a perfectly healthy, functioning body part. So I would say that if you intentionally make yourself, if you intentionally render yourself sterile, that would be immoral. But if you're sterile through no fault of your own, through, say, a birth defect, for example, or an injury, it's not immoral to have sex.
Fascinating. Because when you said that about contraceptives, what are your views on contraceptives? Would it fall along the same lines?
Yeah. So Christians have traditionally believed that contraception is immoral. It wasn't until the 1930s or 1940s in the Lambeth Conference that the Anglicans started moving towards a accepting view on contraception. So my view is the historic Christian view on contraception, that contraception is and is always immoral. So for most Christians today, it's not going to be a very popular position.
Right.
But
it's going to be very controversial.
It's what's entailed by the argument, and it's what Christians have historically believed. And I think I'm on firm ground when I say that contraception is immoral.
Yeah, and one thing that I would want to say to those people is, well, what is your objection to it? It can't just be based on your feelings, that you feel that this should be right. Right? If we follow the logic here, then it leads to this conclusion. You may not like the conclusion, but that's a completely separate matter. Like if you want to use reason and logic, you've got to interact with this argument and interact with your moral theory. Wrapped up in this idea of natural law theory is the idea of what's natural versus what's unnatural, right? And so you gave the example of your eyes.
Right.
So wearing glasses, you have glasses on, that would seem to be quote unquote unnatural.
Yeah.
So is that something like wearing glasses, is that kind of like contraceptives because you're changing your eyes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So typically when people invoke natural law arguments, critics get this idea, well, by natural, you just mean non-artificial, or you mean something that is not found in nature. Well, when a natural law theorist uses the term natural and unnatural, they refer to proper functioning. So take glasses, for example. When I say an act is wrong because it's unnatural, I mean that it's wrong because it misuses something's proper function. Now, in the case of glasses are actually good for me, because glasses enhance my eye's proper function. They repair a defect I have. I'm nearsighted, and so that's something bad about my eyes that needs to be fixed. So glasses, antibiotics, that kind of stuff is actually natural in the sense that they work to render my body to work on my body in a way that restores it to its proper function. So it's unnatural in the sense that it's not found in the natural world or the animal world. But that's not what the natural law theorist means by nature. The natural law theorist means what's by natural, what's in accordance with proper functioning. And glasses certainly help my eyes function better.
So we've already talked a little about homosexuality. How would natural law theory interact with sex outside of marriage? Because you said that sex, in and of itself, as long as it's sort of toward the end goal, proper function of what sex is supposed to be about, which it seems like two people that are engaged in, heterosexual sexual relationship, that would seem to not really violate anything there. So what would natural law theory say about that, sex outside of marriage?
Yeah, when it comes to sex outside of a marriage, it satisfies the procreation requirement, but it does not satisfy the comprehensive union requirement. So sex is a comprehensive union with a special link towards children. So sex brings together two people that unites them in a way that's specially linked towards children. Now, when we speak of a union, we speak of a coming together of two people in a way that should not. So the dissolution of a union is a bad thing. So if the union that comprises my body falls apart, that's a bad thing because it indicates something has gone wrong with me.
If you lose an arm,
if I lose my arm, there's disunity in my body. Something has gone wrong. So if you enter sex, if you engage in a sexual action without the desire to unite comprehensively with somebody, you're not respecting the comprehensive union part of sex. So when it comes to marriage, when it comes to sex should be done within the context of a marriage, because a marriage is that kind of union that's specifically about a long-term commitment. That's specifically about a permanent, lasting, faithful connection to somebody else. And so if you have sex as just, say, part of a one-night stand, you're not really entering into that long-term, comprehensive, lifelong, faithful union. You're just treating sex as a commodity. You're just treating sex as something that is on and off, something that can be, done at a whim and then just ignored. So the proper context of sex is marriage, because marriage creates that kind of union whereby not just the two spouses, but the children are bound together in a way that creates a family, a single unity that is oriented towards the well-being of all those other people. So sex outside of marriage doesn't respect fully the unitive purpose of sex.
So I've heard from, well, he's not a philosopher, but Lawrence Krauss once said that it's totally natural in the animal kingdom for two males in a species to have sex with each other. So what's your take on that? Like, would you agree that that's natural, or is that unnatural? And how does that relate to homosexuality? Yeah,
so typically when people use natural law arguments, you hear the rejoinder that, well, animals do it too, and that there are many different species of animals who engage in homosexual activity, therefore it must be natural. Well, again, that's not what the natural law theorist means by the term natural. Natural means in accordance with proper function, not what animals do, not what's in the non-artificial part of the world. So when two animals out in the wild, when two male animals have sex with each other, that might be natural in the sense that it's in the animal world, but it's not natural in the sense that it doesn't respect the proper function of what sex is for. And animals do all kinds of things that we shouldn't base our morality on. Animals eat their young, animals forcibly copulate with each other. We shouldn't base our morality on animals. We should base our morality on what's proper for us, our proper function. And our proper function of sex, the proper function of sex for us is that procreation is only possible when you unite with somebody of the opposite sex, not somebody who's a member of the same sex.
So wrapped up in this conversation, natural law theory is the naturalistic fallacy. So why don't you describe that for the audience, and then why you think it doesn't sort of undercut this argument? So
when people typically invoke the naturalistic fallacy, they have two things in mind. They usually confuse one with the other. So first is what's called the is-ought problem. You can't move from a description to a prescription. Second is what G.E. Moore called the open question argument. So these two things are related, but they're kind of distinct. So I'll address the first one. The argument is that you can't move from the way things are to the way things ought to be. You can't move from it is raining to therefore it should be raining. But natural law theory doesn't contain such a move. Natural law theory starts with prescriptions and moves to prescriptions. It's not as if the natural law theorist says, this is the way things are, therefore this is the way things should be. A natural law theorist starts with claims about proper function. And claims about function are inherently normative. Normativity is built into nature. So when I say the heart's purpose is for pumping blood, I'm not just saying that the heart does pump blood. I'm also saying the heart should pump blood. To say that X has the purpose of Y is to say that X should Y. And so I'm not moving. A natural law theorist does not move from an is to an ought, but from an ought to an ought. So there is no inference here from a description to a prescription. Second version of the naturalistic fallacy is the open question argument. And this is a more technical version that it's not really used, but I think it's useful to address it. So G.E. Moore had this argument where Moore said that for any ethical theory, for anything you define as good, you can always ask the question, well, is that good? And because there's always an open question as to whether or not you could call something good, goodness must be something indefinable. So Moore said that goodness is akin to, say, the color yellow, right? You can't define what yellow is. It's just an unanalyzable concept. Well, the problem in Moore's argument is that he assumes that goodness is something that's univocal. But as Peter Gies pointed out, goodness is a kind relative term. We speak of goodness in many different senses. So, for example, a good teacher is not the same thing as a good firefighter. A good pencil is not the same thing as a good tree, right? These things are good in different senses of the term. So when we say that something is good, we are saying that it's, in general, fulfilling of its nature, fulfilling of its proper function. But the content of that can be cashed out differently when it comes to different objects. So Moore's mistake was in assuming that goodness has a univocal or a unilateral or one single meaning, when in reality, goodness is kind relative. But it's not kind relative in that goodness tracks on to something's essence or proper function. So those are the two versions of the is-ought problem, the naturalistic fallacy, and I don't think they're very good arguments against natural law theory.
All right, so let's turn now to the topic of abortion. I understand you've done some pro-life volunteer efforts, but what is your, if you can put it in a couple minutes, what is your basic case against abortion?
Yeah, so I would say that first, your moral value depends on the kind of thing you are, not what you're able to do. Your moral value depends on your being a human person. And what science tells us is that there's overwhelming agreement on this point, from the moment of conception onwards.
Overwhelming agreement among
scientists, among embryologists, among biologists. Just look at the textbooks. So even somebody like Peter Singer concedes that the unborn are human persons. So even many pro-choice philosophers grant the humanity of the unborn. And really, if you look at the science, most people are surprised to know that it's not really a controversial point in science that the unborn are human beings from the moment of conception. Now, the debate is whether or not they're persons, right? Some people want to draw a distinction between human beings and persons. But I think your moral value consists in who you are, the kind of being you are, not what you're able to do. If you make this distinction between human beings and persons, then you run into this problem where personhood becomes a degreed property, right? If you want to say that, well, a person is a being who is self-aware, who can communicate, who can exercise the developed capacity to rational thought, well, then you run into these problems. Well, are you a person when you're asleep, right? Because you're not actually communicating, you're not actually thinking. Or what about when you're in a temporary coma, right? You're not actually reasoning, you're not actually communicating, you're not actually exercising your rational capacity. So your moral value depends on the kind of being you are, and science tells us that from the moment of conception, the unborn are human beings.
Can you summarize the evidence for that proposition that we are here, or that from the moment of conception, the fetus is a human being?
Sure. So the embryo from the earliest stages of development has the human genetic code, human chromosomes, human DNA, human parents. It has everything it needs to develop into a mature form of the kind of being it already is. All it needs is adequate time, nutrition, and a hospitable place to develop. Everything that's needed for its development in terms of its biology, its information, it's already there. It just needs to unfold the capacities that it already has. There's a reason why human embryos develop into humans and not dogs, cats, birds, lions, tigers, zebras, so on and so forth. A human embryo develops into a mature human being because the human embryo is already a human being, albeit immature, but it's a human being nonetheless. And so there is overwhelming agreement that the embryo is human. Now the question is what gives us our value? And when it comes to that question, I already said that the view that your value depends on what you're able to do, what you're able to think of, how you're able to communicate, act, reason, so on and so forth. That has problems in that it can't account for the problem of temporary changes, right? Let's say I knock you out cold. completely cold. You don't have dreams or anything. Well, would it follow that when you're out cold, when you're unable to reason, when you're able to communicate, when you're unable to function like a person, would it follow that you lose your rights as a person? Well, no, that's absurd. There was a difference between being a person and functioning as a person. The unborn are persons with potential. They're not potential persons. And so the unborn should count as persons because they have everything they need to develop into a mature form of the kind of being they already are. And so
let's talk a little more about the distinction between humans and persons.
Cool. Yeah.
Because you don't like that distinction.
I don't like the distinction at all.
Right. So let's talk about that.
So Marianne Warren has an interesting paper in which she argues that if you're a person, you must exhibit at least one or two of 5 criteria she lists. These include self-awareness, communication, the ability to communicate, the ability to act freely, self-motivated activity, the presence of self-concepts, and something other. And Warren says something that has these things qualifies as a person. Something that doesn't have these things doesn't qualify as a person. But Warren's view runs into this problem of temporary changes, right? If I knock you out cold, you don't have any of these things, but surely you still retain your personhood. So here's how I like to think of it. Let's draw a circle, and let's call this circle the class of all persons. Within that circle, we can draw a smaller circle, and we can label that circle the class of or all humans. So all humans are persons, but there might be persons who are not humans, right? There might be intelligent alien species out there. There might, angels are persons. The persons of the Trinity are persons, but they're not humans. So all humans are persons, but not all persons are humans. So being human is sufficient for being a person. So as long as
it's not necessary.
But it's not necessary. We can have persons who are not humans. So the unborn, in virtue of being human, count as persons. And since it's wrong to kill a person, it's wrong to kill the unborn from the earliest moment of conception onwards. As soon as you have an embryo, it becomes wrong to kill it. And that's why abortion is wrong. The common sense case against abortion is rather straightforward. Many philosophers go through, various kinds of hoops to try to avoid the problem of temporary changes, but I don't think those hoops are fruitful paths to take.
Have you heard of Callan Miller's Prudential argument against abortion?
Yeah, so here's how I like to put it personally in terms of an analogy. So suppose you're hunting with a friend, right? And your friend says, I'll go out, set some traps, lay some bait, and you say, okay, well, that's cool. So a few minutes later, you hear rustling in the bushes, right? Now you don't know what that is. It could be your friend laying a trap or setting out bait, or it could be an animal. Do you shoot? Well, given that it could be your friend, it would be better to err on the side of caution. It would be reckless of you to go ahead and pull the trigger if you didn't have reasonable certainty that it wasn't your friend. And so likewise, we can say for abortion, even if we don't know whether or not the unborn are persons, it would still be better to err on the side of caution and not partake in abortion just because it would be reckless, just because we don't have certainty on this issue, and it'd be better not to engage in an action that could potentially take a life. I believe Callan uses the example of a demolition of a building in which you don't, there's a chance in which there might be a person inside, you don't know. It would be reckless to demolish the building.
Morally reckless. Yeah.
Morally reckless, yes.
Morally blameworthy,
Mm-hmm.
completely negligent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Some people say that men cannot pontificate or give their opinion on the ethics of abortion. So apart from whether or not that's true, why do you think that people give this argument so often?
Yeah, I certainly think there's an optics issue here, right? It looks better if you have, say, a woman arguing against abortion because abortion is something that affects the woman. But to more generally, I'd say that whether or not somebody's a man or a woman, what matters is just the argument. the merits of the thing in question. The truth value of a position doesn't depend on the sex of an individual, right? Suppose I made an argument, a really compelling argument against abortion. Why should the fact that I am a man completely invalidate what I've just said? Well, it would be strange to say that.
It's a type of ad hominem.
Yeah, it would be strange to say that if you replaced me with a woman and a woman said the exact same thing I said, that somehow her being a woman makes her opinion more legitimate.
Or makes the argument sound.
Yeah, I mean, so arguments don't have genders or sexes, right? It's about whether or not something is true. And whether or not something is true is a matter of whether or not what you say corresponds to reality. And if it corresponds to reality, it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman making it.
So you'd agree that there are no gender restrictions on the abortion debate?
Yeah, men absolutely. I mean, and it's kind of disingenuous to say that men have absolutely no say in the abortion debate. Because I mean, the unborn, half of the unborn comes from the man, from the male individual. So males have an interested. Fathers have rights too. It's not just the rights of the mother. And so in saying that abortion is just a woman's issue, well, hey, what about the rights of the father, right? So it's almost a kind of discrimination against men to say that men have no right. Well, of course men have rights to pontificate about abortion. They contributed half the genetic material for the unborn. So men have just as much a right as women to speak about abortion. And what's ironic is that this whole argument would undercut the legal justification for Roe v. Wade, right? Roe v. Wade was decided by 9 men. And if you want to say, well, men have nothing to say about abortion, well, I guess we should overturn Roe v. Wade because Roe v. Wade was decided by a group of men who didn't have the lived experiences of women.
If I had a microphone, I'd give it to you to drop right there. But okay, so related to the topic of abortion is the question of bodily autonomy. Mm-hmm. Like, doesn't the woman have the right to do whatever she wants with her body? And then what would you say with Thompson's famous violinist argument?
Yeah, so 2 things. First, the unborn isn't a part of the woman's body. And so it's not a matter of what she does to her own body. There's another individual in question. And even if
you said that this is uncontroversial,
what's
right? That this is a human person.
Oh no, that it's a human being.
Yeah,
right?
It's a human being.
Yeah.
The unborn is a human being, the fetus, the zygote, whatever.
Yeah.
It's a human being, but it's not the woman. It's a different being.
Yeah. So it's not as if, we may grant for the sake of argument that women have the right to do whatever they want to their own body. Actually, I actually think that nobody has the right to do whatever they want to their own body. I think that's
which we already talked about.
Yeah, which we already talked about. But even if a woman did have a right to do whatever she wanted to her own body, the unborn isn't a part of her body. The unborn resides in her body, but it's not a part of her body, right? And so when it comes to decisions like, what can a woman do to her own body? Well, we also have to consider the rights and interests of a third party. Abortion isn't just, an issue involving the woman herself. It's something involving another party that's been created in an act of sex. And also, the man also has a role in this too. It's not just the woman as well. It's also the unborn and the man. Now, Judith Jarvis Thomson had a famous argument that challenged this. Thomson gave the example of a violinist who's hooked up to, I believe it was like a kidney dialysis machine or something like that. And the argument is that, well, surely the violinist has the right. I'm just summarizing the argument here, but the argument is surely that the violinist has the right to unplug from the machine because he doesn't have a duty to sustain the life, or the individual connected to the violinist has the right to unplug from the machine because he doesn't have the duty to sustain the violinist's life. Well, there's a number of things you could say about this. Frank Beckwith has, in his book Defending Life, he gives like 5 or 6 reasons why this is a terrible argument. One crucial point of this analogy is that the relationship between a mother and her child is different from the relationship between 2 strangers, right? Parents have special obligations to their children that strangers don't have special obligations to each other. So a mother has a special obligation to take care of her child that, whereas for 2 strangers, that might be what ethicists call an extraordinary duty. Whereas for women, a mother taking care of her child, it would be an ordinary duty. So there's for one, a disanalogy to be made there. Second, I would say that unplugging from the violinist is different from an abortion. In one case, you're withdrawing treatment. In another case, you're actually doing something that ends, you're actually performing an act of killing. Abortion isn't just withdrawing treatment. Abortion is the active going into a womb and ending the life of a unborn human. So it's not just withdrawing treatment; it's actually an active act of killing. So it's not the act of letting die; it's the act of actively killing. So I could go on about this. I'm not sure how much time we have, but
well, let me ask you this: what is the best objection in favor of abortion, in favor of the pro-choice movement? What is the best argument or objection against pro-life? What is the best reason in your mind that you've seen in favor of abortion?
Yeah. So I don't think the bodily autonomy argument is a very good one. I think if you want to argue for abortion, and I don't think this works, but I think if you want to argue for abortion, the best way to do it is to argue that the unborn aren't persons. If they aren't persons, then they don't have moral status.
They don't have a right to life.
They don't have a right to life, in which case we can do whatever we want to them. So I think the best way to argue for abortion is to go that route, not the bodily autonomy route.
And you've already given several arguments to why that's not good. Okay, well, I think we're out of time. So thank you so much for coming on to Capturing Christianity. Again, this is not something we normally do, talking about these applied ethical theories and moral theory and natural law theory, but it's been really fascinating to have you on. Abortion is something that, for me personally, I think is completely wrong and no one should do it. It's a topic that my wife and I talk about all the time. So again, thanks for coming on, Tim, and hopefully we can have you on again.
Thanks for having me.